Murdered, a podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered, a podcast, we'll be covering the super mysterious and slightly disturbing case of Cindy James. And this is going to be one of those episodes where I feel like half of us will be leaning one way while everybody else is leaning the other way. And then there will be a few like myself who still don't know what the hell's going on even after we wrap this case up. Cindy herself claimed that she was the victim of several harassments, threatening phone calls, and even physical attacks that happened to her right outside of her own home. Or was she? People often debate if these calls, physical attacks, stalking, and harassment were just a 7-year figment of Cindy's own imagination, or maybe just an extreme exaggerated version of the truth, or if all of these things were actually happening to her before her death finally occurred. This is one of those cases where there really are no clear answers, so you'll have to just kind of decide for yourself on what you believe and what you don't once we finish up. Now, before I say let's get it, I can already hear it in my voice. I'm going to be sick soon. It's fine. My husband has had the flu for literally 3 weeks, and now my youngest has been sick off and on for the last 5 days. So, if my voice isn't what it should be, just bear with me. I'm trying here. So, with all that being said, and without further ado, let's get it. Cynthia Elizabeth Hack, who was better known as just Cindy, was born on June 12th in 1944 to her parents Otto and Matilda Hack. She was also the oldest of her parents' 6 kids. Cindy lived in Oliver, British Columbia in Canada, and there wasn't really a whole lot that I could find as far as Cindy's early life and childhood goes, but normally digging back into the 40s doesn't really give you a ton of information, so that's kind of to be expected. But a few of the only things that I could find were that Cindy's mom Matilda was a homemaker and that her dad Otto was in the Canadian Air Force. And then after his military career came to a halt, Otto started working as an English teacher. And I also read that Cindy's dad, Otto, was kind of getting back into the military life again, and he was re-enlisting. He decided to jump back into his military career as Cindy got older into her teenage years and early adulthood. Now, this meant that her family would be relocating yet again, which is a normal thing for people who are serving in the military. They are always being moved around and stationed somewhere else. That's kind of to be expected. But Cindy wasn't a small child with no say-so anymore. She was finally a young adult, and this time, instead of making the move and relocating with her entire family, Cindy opted to stay put while the rest of her family made the move. While Cindy's family was away, she enrolled in nursing school, but Cindy would be sure to write letters to everyone in her family to try to keep in touch with them, to just kind of keep them up to date on her life and the latest happenings, the girl gossip, whatever. And during this time, Cindy had written her parents a 10-page letter to tell them about a man that she'd met. And this 10-page letter was just basically Cindy letting everyone know that she really liked this man and that things were moving in the right direction for like a real long-term relationship. And Cindy could say that with confidence because the two had gotten engaged. Now, somehow, during a 10-page letter, Cindy never mentioned this man's name during these letters, and it also seems like every time Cindy's parents would try to set up a date to meet her new fiancé, or when her parents would pick a holiday for the newly engaged couple to come and visit, something would always come up, and the plans would have to be rescheduled or pushed to a later date. There are also some details that Cindy wrote to her parents about either their relationship or about this man that either didn't line up with things that Cindy had already told them previously, or things that were just inconsistent with some of the things that she had told her parents before. It's also important to note that there is absolutely no one else and nothing else that I could find that could actually verify that this fiancé of Cindy's ever even existed. None of Cindy's friends that lived close by or her coworkers that she would, frequently visit, none of these people had ever met or seen him either. And it was just like no one ever came forward and said that they had met Cindy's perfect mystery man at any point before this. But before Cindy's parents, Otto and Matilda, ever got the chance to meet Cindy's fiancé, Cindy informed them during another letter that she'd sent to her parents that while the newly engaged couple had been on a ski trip, that this nameless, faceless, unnamed man that she had just gotten engaged to had committed suicide because he'd recently found out during a routine medical exam that he actually had terminal cancer. Cindy explained that this unnamed fiancé of hers had kind of gone MIA on this ski trip for a while, and that he'd later been found dead with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. But Cindy had never given her family a name for this mystery fiancé who'd unalived himself, which we'll come back to later because people often question the events that supposedly happened on this ski trip. And then that just leads people to wonder if this was all just a fabricated story or if it had actually happened. So I guess hindsight is 20/20 because no one probably thought much about this until after Cindy's death and after people started wondering if Cindy had been making a lot of other things up too. But Cindy was young and eventually she would move on from the loss of her former short-lived fiancé and their engagement, and she went on to get married when she was about 22 years old. And although Cindy was only 22 when she got married, her husband was almost 20 years older than her. And the ages and birthdays aren't super clear, so he's somewhere like 40, 42-ish. Now, Cindy had married Dr. Roy Makepeace on December 9th in 1966. And Dr. Roy Makepeace was a psychologist who worked at the Vancouver General Hospital. And it seems that Cindy met Roy during the last year or two while she was still attending nursing school there. So Cindy was a student at the same hospital where Roy was a doctor, and this sounds like every hospital TV show I've ever watched. Cue the script of Grey's Anatomy. But moving right along. Cindy went on to graduate from that same nursing school where she'd met her husband Roy, and she graduated in 1966. And I could be wrong because I didn't actually take note of this part, but if I'm remembering correctly, Roy Makepeace was also married when he and Cindy started seeing each other. So surely if he was actually married, then he had to have divorced his first wife sometime before he and Cindy tied the knot. And it just does not seem like Cindy's dad, Otto, really liked or cared for Cindy's new husband, Roy, very much from what I've seen in interviews with Roy and with the statements that he's made during those interviews. Cindy's dad said that Cindy was kind of sweet to a fault, like it was her strength, but also her weakness all at the same time. And after Cindy had graduated nursing school, she worked with children with behavioral disorders or emotional disorders. And she excelled at this job, even though Cindy would never have kids of her own. And Cindy would go on to work this job for more than 10 years with her employers and her coworkers, all having nothing but good things to say about her. And this becomes more important as we go because they all worked with her for so long, and they all saw absolutely nothing to indicate that Cindy struggled with her mental health or her mental well-being. So it seems irrelevant now, but just store that little nugget of information away for later. Because Cindy was working at a hospital, so that would mean that she was working around a lot of psychiatrists, therapists, counselors, like a lot of people who are educated in the field of being able to spot someone who's suffering from mental health related issues. And no one that Cindy ever worked with ever recalled anything to indicate that Cindy was struggling mentally at all. Now, Cindy and her husband Roy were married for like 16 years before they separated in July of 1982. And it was said that their marriage wasn't perfect, but of course, no marriage is. But then there's a statement that I found that Roy actually made himself, where he claims that during their entire 16-year marriage, that he'd only ever slapped or hit Cindy twice. Which, it's like, okay, buddy, like, you want a high five? What? And he even says this kind of like, oh, I only hit her twice in our whole 16 years together. That's not that bad. Which, that's not a thing, Roy. That's just not a thing. Now, after the 16 years, Cindy and Roy decided to separate. But according to Roy, this separation was supposed to be like a trial run or a test drive, if you will. And they were going to separate just to see if they really wanted to get divorced or if maybe the separation would make them want to work things out with one another. which is smart. I'll give them that. That's pretty smart. And after their initial separation, Cindy was able to get into a house of her own, which was a huge milestone for Cindy in her eyes, as it should be. And this was probably just something that Cindy needed to prove to herself that she could do, and she did the damn thing. But it would only be about 2 or 3 months after Cindy and Roy separated that Cindy would start getting these super strange phone calls. And these calls would either be like really heavy breathing coming from the other end of the call, or there would be a man on the other end of the call making like threatening remarks to Cindy. And then other times, Cindy claimed that there was no noise at all coming from the other end of the phone, just total silence, which I almost feel like the silence would be scarier than the heavy breathing or the menacing male voices. I don't know, maybe that's just me. Now, soon after moving into this new house, Cindy would also report that there were times when she would find people looking into her windows at night, and then there were other times that Cindy would go outside to check on the noise, and she would find that her porch lights or her phone lines had been tampered with. And this would go on for 7 years. Yes, I said 7 years of threatening and harassing phone calls, weird stalking, and over those 7 years, Cindy would file hundreds of incidents reports with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is just Canadians' fancy way of saying law enforcement. But it wasn't always just threatening phone calls or heavy breathing. There were multiple physical attacks that turned violent, and even those creepy letters that looked like they come straight out of a horror movie. And these events only seemed to get worse after Cindy would make reports to law enforcement about what was happening. Something I found that I thought was crazy, though, was that according to Cindy, she was positive that she already had a stalker even before the first incident or phone call ever happened. Cindy's first report to Canadian law enforcement was made on October 7th in 1982, and Cindy reported that she'd started getting phone calls where no one would speak or make any noise at all on the other end of the phone. But that all changed on October 11th because that was the first time that the caller had said or done anything at all to let Cindy know that there was someone on the other line. Because this was the first night that the caller just sat doing these weird-ass heavy breathing type of things into the phone, but they still didn't say a single word. Then on the very next night, on October 12th, Cindy got another call, but this time the caller did speak. But the only thing that was said was, quote, "I'll get you one night, Cindy." And that was said in a low whisper, but even at just a whisper, Cindy said that she could tell that this voice on the other end sounded like it was just filled with rage and anger. Which I feel like maybe the heavy breathing calls could kind of be chalked up to kids prank calling or somebody kind of messing with you. But now it's escalating and they're using her name. But they're not just using the name that would be listed in the phone book, because if that were the case, then they would have said Cynthia, which is her legal birth-given name. But they didn't. They said Cindy, which was a nickname that she went by. So this one short call definitely brings the fear factor up a notch. So after this call where the caller finally spoke for the first time, Cindy called police to see if maybe there was something that they could do. And the police did come out and take a statement from Cindy, and they even looked around the outside of the house to see if there were any signs that maybe someone had been standing outside messing around near the house, but they never found anything of substance. Cindy did make sure to let the police know that she had thought she had a stalker even before the calls and stuff started. Which, that just makes me wonder when Cindy first thought that she might have a stalker. Like, was it a week before the call started? Was it like months or years? Or as soon as she left her husband? Like, when did she first think that she had a stalker? That seems like an important piece of information that I do not have. Now, when the police come out, they do encourage Cindy to keep a logbook or like a journal of some sort. And they told Cindy to log any other calls like this that she gets. They explained that she should write down the date and time of the calls and what was said and things like that. So they were at least taking her claim seriously, but it wasn't long after the police presence had cleared out that Cindy received yet another call. And this time the caller said, quote, "You fucking bitch, I'll get you." Which makes me wonder if Cindy's stalker knew that the police had just left and that they weren't there anymore. But that would be the last call that Cindy got that night. She, however, did get a call the next night, though, and this is when you can see that things are starting to escalate. The calls are becoming more frequent, and the caller is becoming more familiar with Cindy and is even comfortable using Cindy's name and speaking into the phone once Cindy answers the phone. So the call that came in on the following night, the caller said, quote, "So you think calling the police will keep you safe? You wait. I've got my zipper opened, and I'm talking to my throbbing." And Cindy hung up the phone before the caller was able to finish their sentence. And thankfully, Cindy was logging every single call and what was said during those calls. And it was yet again on October 15th, so just a few days later, that Cindy was laying down and settling into bed when she could hear what sounded like someone walking around the outside of her house. Now, she did not call the police to report it this time, but the next morning when she got up, her front porch lights had been smashed and broken. Which, this kind of makes me think that whoever was stalking Cindy was kind of hoping that she would come outside the night before when she initially heard the noises outside of her house, and that she'd go outside and take a look around and maybe see what it was, and that the porch light being smashed would have made it dark enough that the stalker would have been able to take Cindy by surprise. But this is pure speculation on my part, and probably too many true crime stories that I constantly consume. Now, it was this same day that Cindy claims to have heard someone walking around her house on October 15th that Cindy returned home from work to find that there had been a rock thrown through the window in her house and that someone had seemingly gone inside. But when she went in to take a look around, there was nothing missing from inside of her house. Like, nothing at all had been tampered with or moved. Nothing was missing or misplaced. So, was this just the stalker's way of letting Cindy know that they could get to her if they really wanted to, even if she was inside of her own home? Because that's what it kind of seems like to me. It was only 4 days after the rock had been thrown through Cindy's window on October 19th that Cindy came home to find that one of her pillows had been cut up and torn to shreds. But again, nothing was out of place or missing. And Cindy had been sure to report every single incident to the police, but every time that the police got there and they took a look around, they always found absolutely nothing to support the fact that someone had been there tormenting Cindy. And eventually, police started asking around, and there was actually a neighbor who had seen a man standing outside of Cindy's house on more than one occasion. But this neighbor was absolutely certain that it was not Cindy's ex-husband, Roy Makepeace. This neighbor said that they knew Roy and they knew what Roy looked like, and that they didn't know this man that had been standing outside of Cindy's house. And the police eventually get to a point where they kind of suspect that maybe these things aren't actually happening to Cindy, and if they are, maybe she's doing them to herself. And they're probably thinking this way because Cindy had started calling so often to report so many different things, and the police were always sent right out to check on her house. But they were never able to find anything that seemed like it could be a clue or a solid piece of evidence to point to who's been tormenting Cindy inside of her own home. Just nothing of all was ever found to suggest that these things were actually happening. And at one point, during one of the phone calls that Cindy had gotten, she had hung the phone up and closed her blinds or curtains or whatever to cover her windows. And then Cindy's phone rang again immediately afterwards. And the mystery caller told Cindy that it wasn't going to do her any good to hide behind the closed blinds or the curtains that she'd pulled to, because he could get to her regardless if he really wanted to. And this mystery caller also let Cindy know that they knew exactly which room in the house that she was in at the time. So one of the policemen named Patrick McBride, who had been called out to Cindy's house on more than one occasion, and who ended up being the lead investigator on Cindy's case, well, he decided to bring over new locks and deadbolts to Cindy's house and he even installed them for her on her exterior doors. Now, Officer McBride also offered to stay at Cindy's house for like 2 weeks so that he could do his own surveillance and investigation on her house while he was there, which is odd, to say the very least. But Officer McBride was going through a divorce or a separation of his own, and this could be a way to help both of them. He would have somewhere to stay, and Cindy would have round-the-clock surveillance and protection by an actual police officer. So as weird as it seems, it was the 80s, so what can you say? But like I mentioned, Patrick McBride had just separated from his wife around the same time. So this seems oddly convenient for Officer McBride to offer up his help to be a live-in protector when he had so recently just separated from his own wife. Nevertheless, he did stay for 2 weeks at Cindy's house to try to figure out what was really going on. So, Patrick's first night in Cindy's house was on October 31st, 1982, so Halloween night. That's perfect. And it was only a few days after Patrick started staying at Cindy's house that he found Cindy's ex-husband Roy sitting outside the back of Cindy's house in an alleyway. And Roy was just kind of sitting in his car lurking, and allegedly, Roy had a few guns in his car when Officer McBride confronted him outside of Cindy's house. But when he was confronted, Roy just claimed that he was also trying to catch Cindy's stalker too. So they're both just here to help, honestly. So now we have Cindy's ex-husband and an overly friendly police officer who are both supposed to be looking into Cindy's stalker case. Which Cindy's ex-husband Roy and Officer McBride actually ended up becoming pretty good friends throughout the course of this investigation, which it did last 7 years, so at that point I think it would be inevitable. Now let's talk about the one thing that does make Cindy's case a little bit more credible, and that's the fact that Officer Patrick McBride was actually there for one of the calls that Cindy received. The caller was silent, but he did say that there was a woman's voice in the background, and the police even attempted to trace this call. But that lead didn't actually result in anything helpful. The call was traced, but nothing was ever found. So, this would have been hard to pull off, especially in the 80s. If Cindy were doing this herself, she would not have been able to call her house from another phone without Officer McBride, realizing what was going on. So then on November 28th, Officer McBride did find that Cindy's phone lines had been cut in multiple places. And soon after the phone lines were found cut, Officer McBride asked Cindy to be his wife for as long as they both shall live, which, I'm going to just say this because it's my podcast and I can. This should be a real big red flag. But we'll continue. Cindy said no to the marriage proposal, probably because they'd only been seeing each other for a whole last month at this point. But the two did date off and on for a short while, and it was really never anything more than that, or at least not from what I could find. Now, Officer McBride eventually moved out with no more evidence of proof or anything else ever happening to Cindy. The two still dated casually and they stayed friends, but there were no wedding bells in their future. But from here, things only started to get worse for Cindy. She started finding raw meat sitting outside of her house, which I feel like this raw meat thing says a lot about the times. Because who do you know right now that can afford to buy meats just to sit them outside of someone's house to send an unspoken threat? Nobody, that's who. Because groceries are too damn high for that now. But that's besides the point. Cindy would also later find dead cats hanging by their necks in her backyard on multiple different occasions. And one of the dead cats that Cindy had found outside of her house had a note attached to it, and it said something along the lines of, "You're next," that had been written on the note. Now, Cindy's own dog had also been tied up and had a cord wrapped around its neck. Luckily, Cindy's dog was okay, but this still had to be the most terrifying thing. But this is just an escalation because Cindy was still getting all of these calls, and the police were still coming out to Cindy's house after she made a report every time. Cindy was still keeping a journal of all the calls and the notes and shit that she was getting and what dates and what times they were coming in at, and if the caller actually spoke or if they just breathed heavy. Like, Cindy would write exactly what was happening and what was said during these calls. And like I said, Officer McBride had even gone so far as to install new deadbolts and locks onto Cindy's doors for her, maybe to make her feel a little safer inside of her house. But none of these things seemed to help, and there was still virtually no evidence found when the police would come out and investigate these claims. The police also put a wiretap on Cindy's home phone to try to trace the calls that were coming in. And even though the calls never stopped, the calls also never lasted long enough to actually be able to trace where the calls were coming from. So that seems like a no-go. Now, right before Christmas in 1982, Cindy found a picture of a woman who had her neck cut, and it read Merry Christmas. And she found this picture right outside of her house, and the picture was stained with like a red ink that was probably supposed to resemble blood. And things like this just kept happening. Cindy would get ominous letters and notes, and it was always the kind like you would see in a scary movie, where all of the letters are kind of cut out of magazines, and they say things like, I see you. And she would get pictures of knives and people being strangled and ropes tied around trees outside of her house. And the way that they were tied on these trees were tied to make them like into a noose. And it eventually got to a point where the calls, the walking around the outside of Cindy's house at night, the phone lines being cut, the porch lights being busted, the dead animals hanging around, these things were just becoming a daily occurrence, but it also wasn't serious enough to be considered or included as actual evidence. And this is when things eventually escalate to a physical attack happening on Cindy. It was January 27th in 1983 when the first physical attack happened. Cindy's friend Agnes had come over for like a regular visit with her good friend Cindy. And when Agnes got to Cindy's house and Cindy didn't answer the door after she knocked a few times, Agnes just thought at first that maybe Cindy was in the bath, or maybe she was in a different part of the house where she couldn't really hear the knocks from the door. But as Agnes went inside and she looked around the house a little, she saw Cindy out back laying on the ground. Cindy was unconscious and had black nylon cord or rope of some kind wrapped around her neck. Now, once Cindy regained consciousness, she was able to tell Agnes that she had been attacked by two men while she was walking into her garage. Cindy didn't really remember much about the attacks, but what she did remember was that she was going into her garage to get a box and that there was a knock at her back door. And honestly, Cindy probably just thought that this was Agnes knocking at the door. But Cindy said when she opened the door that there was a man standing there. Cindy also said that she didn't know or recognize this man that was standing in front of her, which makes me think that it wasn't her husband Roy Makepeace who she was separated from, and that it wasn't Officer McBride who Cindy had been casually dating. Because if that were the case, Cindy would have recognized either one of them, but Cindy says that as soon as she opened the door, that the man immediately forced her back into her garage, where a second man was standing in the garage waiting. Cindy says that both of the men slashed and stabbed at her with a knife, and that the two men kept strangling her over and over again, almost like taking turns doing it. Cindy said that one of the men tied the nylon stockings around her neck to knock her unconscious. Now, Cindy also believes that her attackers had used a knife to sexually assault her, but that after being slashed and stabbed at, Cindy says that from here, that's when she passed out and doesn't remember anything else. But that she was almost sure that the men had also raped her with a knife at some point during this attack. And although this was the first physical attack on Cindy, it wouldn't be the last. Cindy firmly believed that her friend Agnes had kind of interrupted these two men that had been attacking her, and that Agnes was probably the only reason that she was even still alive after this first attack. And it doesn't seem like the police really did any fingerprinting or any kind of real investigation of any kind. Granted, it was the early 80s, but still. So the police did have the hospital run some exams on Cindy, and no physical evidence was found to prove that Cindy had been sexually assaulted with a knife, which I feel like that wouldn't be hard to prove. But that's really all that seems to have been done as far as the investigation goes, or at least that's what it seems like from an outsider looking in on this case. And it seems like it was later on in the year after this first attack is when the dead cats would be found around Cindy's yard hanging by their necks. So after this first physical attack, this is when Cindy decided to make her first move to a different address. But that wasn't all, because Cindy also painted her car a completely different color and even changed her whole ass last name. Cindy changed her last name from Makepeace to James. So that's how we got here from her maiden name to her married name to her resorting to having to change her own last name again. And all of this was done in an attempt to evade her stalker. But it honestly didn't seem to matter what Cindy did. She could move, she could change her name, and she could paint her car. And nothing seemed to be able to keep her safe from this stalker. Because eventually, Cindy's unknown stalker would find Cindy no matter what she tried to do to stay below the radar. And eventually, all of these things would start up again every time. And the police were growing more suspicious with every report that Cindy made. And they were kind of starting to wonder if maybe Cindy wasn't kind of doing a lot of these things to herself. Or maybe if she was even exaggerating these events when she relayed them back to police, just to make it seem more dramatic or worse than what they actually were. But Cindy never wavered about what was happening to her. And according to Cindy, the caller knew every single time that she made any kind of report to the police. And at one point, the unknown caller had even called Cindy to let her know that the police weren't going to be able to keep her safe. Which seems true at this point, honestly. So in February of 1983, Cindy decided to move into a different house, and she did this with the hopes that her stalker wouldn't know where she lived or how to find her new address. But it would be less than a week after Cindy moved into her new house that she would get a letter. And this letter was ominous and sounds low-key kind of threatening. The letter read, quote, "Run, rabbit, run. I'll show you how fucking good I am soon. Bang, bang, you are dead." So this has to be classified as some sort of death threat. But after Cindy claimed that she had been sexually assaulted by a knife during her first attack, and then the hospital not finding any evidence to back those claims up, the police were kind of questioning if maybe Cindy had been the one behind all of the things that she claimed happened to her. And even though the police weren't sure if Cindy was doing these things to herself or if she was really truly in danger, they did end up spending over $1.5 million just on the investigation of Cindy's case. So they were at least still doing the bare minimum, even though they weren't sure if these things were actually happening or not. And this is one of those examples where I always say that I would much rather the police overreact than underreact. So we gotta give credit where credit is due, because they are at least doing their job. Now, after Cindy had gotten this first letter at her new address, that's when the phone calls started back up. And the police were still coming out, and they were still making reports, and they were still doing their job every single time Cindy called. Now, they may have rolled their eyes every time they answered the phone and heard that it was Cindy, but they were still doing their jobs. Now, in April of 1983, so only 2 months after Cindy had moved into this new house and gotten this threatening letter, Cindy tried to move to a different address again in April. And this is one of those things that makes me kind of believe that Cindy was actually being stalked and harassed, because who the hell can afford to move every few months? She's obviously renting, she's not buying, so she would need a security deposit, first and last month's rent, a pet deposit because she has a dog, she would have to get all of the utilities switched over from one address to the other, etc., etc. But then aside from the cost of moving, so even just put that aside, moving is literally the worst thing in the entire world. No one wants to pack their entire lives up into boxes just to unpack that same shit into a different place. So, I mean, this is just one of those things where even if she wasn't being attacked and harassed, I believe that she believed that she was. So, she moved for the first time in February, and then she got the letter and the call started back, so she moved again in April, just 2 months after the first move. And I just don't know if she would be going through all this trouble if she were lying, I don't know. Now, during this time of the moving into the new house, Roy Makepeace was trying to make peace with Cindy. See what I did there? But Roy was buying Cindy all of these expensive things, and he'd even paid for Cindy to go visit with some of her family that was in Indonesia. But regardless of the gifts and the excessive spending, Cindy never did get back together with Roy, so just something to mention. But again, if Cindy saw two of her attackers when she was first physically attacked, she would have recognized Roy, and she said pretty clearly that it wasn't him. But just a few weeks after this trip to visit with her family in Indonesia, Cindy got another letter at her newest and most current address. And also, before we get into this letter, can we just take a minute to remember that everyone's personal information wasn't as easily accessible and plastered all over social media and the internet in the early 80s like it is today. So how the hell was this stalker getting all of Cindy's new information when she was changing numbers and addresses like people change underwear? It almost seems like this either has to be Cindy doing these things to herself, or it has to be someone that is close to Cindy, or at least close enough to Cindy to be someone that she would give her new address or phone number to when she would have them changed. But back to this letter that Cindy got after she returned from Indonesia. This letter said basically just a bunch of random words that said welcome back, death, blood, hate, etc. And don't ask me why etc. was even listed on that letter, but it was. So here we are. Now, it was shortly after Cindy had gotten this letter at her newest address that she finally decided to hire a private investigator of her own to look into what was really going on. This private investigator was a man by the name of Ozzie Cabin, and shortly after Cindy hired Ozzie gave Cindy a two-way radio so that she could get in touch with him easily and quickly, even if her phone lines were cut. And he'd also given Cindy some kind of panic button that she could wear, almost like a life alert thing, the really cheesy commercials, where the little elderly lady is laying on the ground saying, "Help, I've fallen and I can't get up." Okay, that seems like almost exactly what Ozzie gave Cindy to use as a means of a way to get in touch with him in a hurry or during an emergency. But it was shortly after Ozzie gave Cindy the two-way radio and the wearable panic button that Cindy would start receiving calls from her stalker at work. And she would also come home from work some days and find cats hanging from the trees in her backyard and her garden. And Cindy would find these dead cats on more than one occasion. This was a regular thing. And when coworkers of Cindy would answer these calls from her stalker that were being made to her at work, all of her coworkers said that during these calls, no one ever said anything. But I'm assuming that most of Cindy's coworkers knew about what was going on with her, so they probably just assumed that these calls were coming from Cindy's stalker, even if maybe they weren't. So then on January 30th, 1984, Cindy's private investigator, Ozzie, heard some strange noises coming from Cindy's side of their two-way radios, so he headed straight over. When Ozzie arrived at Cindy's house and he managed to make his way inside, Ozzie found Cindy laying in the living room floor with a knife sticking through Cindy's hand. She was unconscious, and after taking a closer look, Ozzie noticed that there was also a note under Cindy's hand that the knife had been stuck through. The note was also one of these notes where each individual letter had been cut out of a magazine and glued together to make one word, and this note read, quote, "Now you must die, cunt," which really only leaves me with one major question. If this stalker's goal was to murder Cindy, then why wouldn't he have just killed her right then? He had the chance, and yet he still let her live. This stalker had already broken into Cindy's house, attacked her, stabbed a knife through her hand, knocked her out, and then just left her there, knowing that she would live through the knife wound in the hand. Why? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. If the goal was to kill Cindy, he could have easily accomplished that goal right then and there. But he didn't. And now's probably a good time to mention that Cindy had reportedly told friends on more than one occasion that she didn't think that her stalker wanted to actually kill her, but that instead, she thought that he wanted to scare her to death in the most literal way. Which would make sense if Cindy was right. That would make sense as to why he keeps attacking her and then leaving her in a condition where she would be able to heal and survive. Now, after Ozzy found Cindy in this condition, of course, he took her to the hospital, and from there she gave her statement. Her statement claimed that the last thing that she remembered was that a man had kind of showed up inside of her house, that he'd hit her on the head with something hard and blunt, and Cindy says that the hit to the head is what knocked her unconscious. But that when she came to for a short period of time, that she did try to fight back, but that this man stuck her in the arm with a needle. So doctors at the hospital looked into this needle mark on Cindy's arm, and there was actually a mark that matched a needle, and the mark was on her arm. But after a toxicology report was ran, there was nothing that was found in Cindy's system. So why would someone stick her in the arm with an empty needle? I'm not sure. I don't think they would, but I don't know. So doctors were looking for any kind of substance that would knock her out, put her unconscious, something like that. But then just absolutely nothing was ever found when they ran the toxicology report. Now, one thing that police did find during their investigation on this particular incident with Cindy is that when they went into Cindy's house to have a look around, police did find blood that looked as if it had been cleaned in a circular motion in Cindy's kitchen floor. Almost as if someone had tried to clean up a bloody mess. But what stalker is taking the time to clean up part of a crime scene? Now, the blood being in the kitchen floor and looking as if someone had tried to clean it up is weird, and it's weird because Cindy claims that the attack happened while she was in her living room. So why was there blood that someone had tried to clean up in the kitchen if the attack didn't happen in the kitchen? I don't know. That part is weird. But throughout all of these things that keep happening to Cindy, the police are still doing their due diligence. They were still leaving patrol cars parked outside of Cindy's house to keep watch. And every time they would do one of these stakeouts on Cindy's house, they would never find anything that would suggest that anything was being done. And a lot of the times, nothing did happen when they were there, which is something else to keep in mind. But they also never saw anything to suggest that Cindy was the one doing these things to herself either. So they weren't able to find any evidence one way or another, no matter what they believed or suspected. Now, it was on June 18th that Cindy called her private investigator, Ozzy, and she was in a frenzy. So, naturally, Ozzy headed straight over to Cindy's place, and when he got there, Ozzy found Cindy in her garden. Cindy told Ozzy that someone had broken into her house, and when Ozzy did a walkthrough of the house, he found Cindy's dog hiding in the basement of Cindy's house. Now, Cindy's dog had been tied up with a black nylon rope, and this looked a lot like the same black nylon rope that had been used to hang the cats around Cindy's house for a while now. While Ozzy looked around, he also saw another note laying there on the ground, and this note said, "Happy birthday." But this note wasn't the only thing that was left this time. There were also some explicit pictures close by to where the happy birthday note was left, and there was also a cigarette butt that was found on the windowsill, but it wasn't the same brand of cigarettes that Cindy smoked. And if you know smokers, you know that they usually don't vary on the brand that they smoke, that they usually only smoke, quote-unquote, their brand. Now, the next big event that happened was on July 1st when Cindy told Ozzy that two men dressed as police officers showed up at her front door. But Cindy says that when she used her two-way radio to let Ozzy know what was going on, the two men took off. So that's weird, because I'd really like to know what made Cindy believe that these two men weren't actually police officers. How did she know that they weren't real police officers? I'm not sure. And then on July 9th, Cindy's mom was spending the night with Cindy when her mom woke up to Cindy's dog barking like crazy. Of course, the dog barking woke Cindy's mom up, and when she got up, she found Cindy walking around double-checking all the locks in the windows and the doors around the house. Now, during the midst of all this commotion, Cindy's doorbell rang, and when Cindy and her mom went to check it out, they found that a window near the front door was cracked. So Cindy's mom was with Cindy when the doorbell went off, and I'm assuming that this window by the front door wasn't already cracked before this, or I feel like it wouldn't have been brought up at all. So this is kind of another witness besides Cindy who has at least seen some of the things that are happening. Cindy's mom was there for the doorbell being rang and the window next to the front door being cracked or broken. So that has to be a witness to some kind of, whatever's going on here. And it was just 2 weeks after this doorbell incident that Cindy was walking her dog in a park that was close by her house when she was attacked by a man. Now, this happened somewhere around 8:30 in the morning, and to hear Cindy tell it, the man who attacked her had a beard and drove a greenish-colored van. But in the passenger seat of this van that her attacker was driving, there was a woman in the front seat. So this now brings in the possibility that maybe the two people that Cindy keeps reporting about attacking and harassing her aren't just two men. What if it's been a man and a woman this whole time? Now, it wasn't until around midnight that night that Cindy was trying to get inside of one of her neighbor's houses, and this neighbor found Cindy trying to get inside of their house, but Cindy was pretty dazed and confused, and she also had some kind of black nylon rope around her neck. So this is how we found out about the attack at the park. Cindy was attacked at 8-ish, 8:30, and at midnight she was trying to get into one of her neighbor's houses to get help. Now, from here, Cindy was taken to the hospital, and during this exam, there were 2 puncture wounds that were found on Cindy's right arm. Now, oddly enough, while Cindy was being treated and examined at the hospital, one of the hospital staff reported that a man with a thick accent had called the hospital, asking about what their security policies were. Now, the police wanted to talk to the receptionist who had initially taken this call. Police brought in a recording of Cindy's ex-husband, Roy Makepeace, and the police asked this receptionist if Roy's voice and his accent sounded like the same voice and the same accent of the caller who had asked about the hospital's security policy. And the receptionist said that it was a strong possibility that the 2 voices and accents were the same. And I have a thought on this call about the security policies. So maybe Cindy's ex-husband, Roy Makepeace, did hear that Cindy had been attacked, and maybe he was calling to see if they would be able to give him any information about her condition or something like that. If they're not married anymore, he wouldn't have access to her medical records or history. And I don't think I've mentioned it at this point, but Roy Makepeace was from South Africa, so he would have had a thicker, much different kind of accent than what you would typically hear in Canada. So this could be something that's been exaggerated and sounds as if it could have been Cindy Stalker, or possibly it could have just been Roy being the stalker the whole time. I don't know. But let's jump forward to about the 3-year mark of Cindy being tormented. Because I'm sure you've forgotten by now, but this went on for 7 years. Cindy lived this kind of torture day in and day out for 7 years if someone was actually doing these things to her. And on the other hand, if Cindy were the one doing these things to herself, then 7 years is a hell of a commitment. So now in 1985, Cindy was put under hypnosis to try to help pull some more information about some of the attacks that she couldn't really remember. And during one of these hypnotherapy sessions, Cindy recalled that she had actually watched Roy Makepeace murder and dismember a man and a woman. Now, she claims that Roy killed this man and woman with an axe while they were on vacation in 1981. Cindy also recalled that while Roy was dismembering the bodies, that he had rubbed the murdered couple's blood on her face. And if this actually happened, this could be one of those things that was just so traumatic that Cindy was able to just block it out of her memory or disassociate herself from this memory altogether. And that would have come out once she agreed to go under hypnosis. Now, one important detail about this memory of Roy killing 2 people on a vacation is that Cindy's sister Melanie had actually been with them on this particular vacation. And Melanie says that this was very much just a normal average vacation and that no murders or dismemberments happened at all during this vacation. Now, Cindy didn't actually remember any of this until she'd gone under hypnosis, but then afterwards, Cindy claimed to remember it all happening. Like it had just been a memory that had been unlocked for good. And the police went down this whole rabbit hole of Roy Makepeace murdering and dismembering 2 people. They checked missing persons cases in the area where they vacationed. I mean, they took these claims seriously. But there was obviously nothing ever found. Now, at the end of June in 1985, Cindy had tried overdosing on pills as a means of committing suicide, and she was involuntarily committed into a psychiatric facility. So, this is another one of those pieces of information that makes me kind of believe that these things were actually happening to Cindy, or at the very least, that Cindy believed that these things were happening to her. Whatever it was enough to make her want to unalive herself. But let's keep going. In July of 1985, Cindy agreed to let the police do a wiretap on her phone so that police could hear phone conversations between herself and Roy Makepeace. And it was during this phone call that Cindy finally broke down and just flat out accused Roy of being the one behind everything that had been happening to her for so long. She also confronted Roy about the memory that she'd regained while under hypnosis about him killing 2 people, but naturally Roy did not admit to any of these claims or allegations. He denied everything and even told Cindy that she was suffering from a, quote-unquote, an enormous revenge fantasy. So he basically told her that she was crazy, that he'd never killed and dismembered 2 different bodies, and that he'd also never been the one stalking, harassing, or physically attacking her. Now, in this same month of July 1985, Cindy received a package, and when she opened it, inside of the package was a black nylon rope, and alongside the nylon rope, there was another weirdly worded note. This note read, quote, "Blood flowing freely." So, none of these letters or notes that Cindy gets are actually whole sentences. They're all just a very few random words that are supposed to sound threatening or ominous or menacing. Now, the next kind of big thing that happened wasn't until 4:45 a.m. on August 21st, 1985. And this is when Cindy's bathroom in her basement caught fire. Now, this is where things get kind of interesting, because when the fire department and the police showed up to Cindy's house, they saw Cindy and her private investigator, Ozzy, in kind of an argument. Cindy was explaining to Ozzy that she'd taken her dog out for a walk at around 3:15 a.m., and that when she'd gotten back home, that's when she'd found the fire. Now, this is just me running through a slew of questions in my own head, and I'm just going to say them out loud, because why the hell was she out walking her dog at 3-something in the morning when she knows that she has a stalker who has already physically attacked her on more than one occasion? I mean, I'm not victim blaming or anything, you do you, boo. But with everything going on almost a daily basis, I don't know that I'd be walking my dog in the dead-ass middle of the night. But I was also kind of wondering if, since she did work at a hospital, maybe she'd gotten home from a late shift and her dog had been inside the whole time, and then maybe she had no choice but to take the dog out. But at this point, I think I'd just be house training my dog to use the bathroom in the bathtub. Fun fact about me, I actually did train my dog to use the bathroom in our bathtub, because he absolutely refuses to go outside in the rain, and it rains a lot in South Carolina, especially in the summertime. So when he was a puppy, I did train him to go into the tub if he wouldn't go outside, or maybe if we were gone all day long and he hadn't been out all day since we'd left. And it just made it so much easier for me. Call me crazy, but I'd rather scrub, bleach, and Lysol my tub than my carpet. And I feel like this was kind of low-key genius of me, but I'm getting off topic. I'm just saying, she could have put puppy pads down. She could have done a number of different things, besides walking her dog at 3-something in the morning with a legit stalker preying on her at all times. She could have probably asked someone to walk with her, and they would have, especially, with the circumstances. So, back to the crime scene. Police weren't able to find any sign that Cindy's house had been broken into, and they found that the only possible way to get inside of Cindy's house without actually breaking in would have been through a pretty small window in the basement where the fire had actually been started. But when police checked the window, there was no dust or smoke soot that seemed to be disturbed, so that didn't seem likely. Police did, however, find newspapers that had been balled up and burned and singed a little bit in the bathroom, and this seems to be the turning point where police are truly, honestly, at the point where they think that Cindy had set her own bathroom on fire, which in turn made them kind of believe that Cindy very well could have been the one behind all of these attacks. It seems like police had kind of suspected that Cindy could have been responsible before this fire was set, but the lack of evidence that anyone was ever inside of her house that night was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Okay, because there is still so much more to this case, and I actually think this is going to be the perfect stopping point for this week. So we'll pick right back up next week in the timeline where we left off, and then we'll get into how Cindy James was eventually found dead. And this case really does make me question so many things, and I've been jotting down all of my own thoughts and theories on this case as I've researched it as I go, and I'll share all of that with you next week at the end of the episode. If you have your own questions or theories, please feel free to reach out to me at the email address listed in the episode description box below this episode. Or you can find and follow me and reach out to me on any of my social media platforms. I do actually try to respond to everybody, even though it's a little overwhelming sometimes. Now, before I sign off, let's do a review of the week because this one is only from 2 weeks ago, so it's pretty recent. This review comes from Nick Marie, and it says, "My kids and I love listening to your podcast every time we're in the car. I have listened to every episode, good, bad, or ugly. You are my soul sister, I swear. Please keep making more podcasts. Don't worry, babe, I got you." But, with all that being said, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.